Untold Tales of Old British Columbia, sold out on Amazon on its official release date. And today, well, it's on the BC bestseller list for its second week in a row. It made the Toronto Star's own top 10 list in Canadian nonfiction. I mean, it's just surprising, and I'm quite grateful. Classing Untold Tales of Old British Columbia as being not unlike a cabinet of curiosities is very much the theme. And so, yes, I have brought down some other things for us to look at today.
Up here at the top here.
Well, that's a very old commemorative plate for Captain George Vancouver. It dates, if I recall correctly, late 19th century, maybe late 1890s, early 1900s. But this particular case really is about the British Columbia centennial of 1958. So once again, we have the totem dollar here. That was such a feature of the 1958 centennial celebrations. Or this array of teacups I have here. You can see all of them having the British Columbia coat of arms on them. That little serving tray in the back has a fascinating, interesting history of its own. That was once owned by Laurie Wallace, who actually was known as Mr. BC in his day. He was so involved in the organizing the centennial celebrations for the province at that time during the W.A.C. Bennett years. What was important to people back then? It really speaks to their view of where they were in society, what was important to them, their place in the world, you know. And so it's a snapshot, really, of the thinking of the time, you might say. This is why I collect these sorts of objects. And as you can see all the way down, there's more of them, more teacups and mugs. And there's an old toffee tin way down at the bottom. You know, 1958 real gemstones. That plate on the bottom was recently brought to me from a new friend from the mainland who, in seeing my collection, said, I want to bring you a centennial plate for your collection. And this is what I'm finding now. People are contacting me increasingly, wanting, you know, a good home for these old pieces of memorabilia, these artifacts and whatnot. So, you know, I have a couple of books up here on the shelf from Lord Lytton, of course. I have Lytton, British Columbia today, poor old Lytton. I'm going to be going up there shortly for a potluck with the community for a book signing and a talk. And, you know, it was about 17 years ago now that I organized a Fraser River War Symposium in the town of Lytton. So I'm looking really forward to going back and just reflecting on how far we've come since that time. You know, we had the Canyon War documentary produced. That whole subject, since my early doctoral work, has really taken off. The Canyon War is definitely a well-known part of our British Columbia history, our historiography, for sure. Everybody is gravitating to that story right now. It's quite gratifying to me, quite frankly. It's got a life of its own now. But Lytton is a fascinating character. What people don't know, you know, the Darby government lasted only 1 year. The government where Lytton was the Secretary of State for the colonies. It was Lytton, of course, who made the big push to have British Columbia created. But what people probably don't know about Lytton are a couple of things. One, he was a hugely popular novelist in his day, right up there with Dickens. Charles Dickens was his friend, actually. I seem to recall Lord Lytton counseled Dickens on one or two of his great novels on how he might rework the endings and whatnot. Lytton was a huge novelist in his day. The pen is mightier than the sword, you know, one of his classic sayings. Of course, some of our American friends, they hold a contest to this day. They castigate Lytton for his line, it was a dark and stormy night, somehow an example of rather slipshod writing. But in his day, he was huge. But here's one other thing about Lytton. Lytton, who was only in office for 1 year, and in that 1 year piloted the British Columbia Act through Parliament. We have to remember, for the British on the other side of the world, with the Fraser River Gold Rush happening in 1858, they had no idea what the hell was going on. But what they did know is what had occurred south of the border in California during their gold rush, and quite frankly, the atrocities committed with regard to indigenous peoples. And so the British government, they wanted to do one thing, and one thing only. They wanted to create temporary law and order to ensure that the California experience would not reoccur north of the 49th parallel. The 49th parallel that had yet to be actually marked on the ground in 1858. Here's one last story about Lytton. He was actually a very well-known occultist, great interest in the occult, and well-known throughout Europe in his day. And there's a fascinating reminiscence, unpublished, held by the BC Archives, by someone who subsequently came out to British Columbia to assist Governor Seymour with the running of the colony of British Columbia. And he says in his own words, before he left to come out to BC, he met with Lytton. And during his visit at Nebsworth, the Lytton family home, that the former colonial secretary told him his future. And he says everything ultimately unfolded as he had predicted. Many fascinating stories about Lytton. It's this issue of the Victoria Daily Times from July 15th, 1958. So it's the centennial celebrations of the province. And this issue, the centennial edition, is huge and all about British Columbia, its history, and what I find particularly remarkable in this issue is just chock full of stories. Here's one by Bruce Hutchinson, the Dean of Canadian Journalism. You know, many interesting authors in here, but the sheer scope of the advertising itself by so many companies who'd come with the gold rush or shortly thereafter, who were still operating in the capital city at that time. Of course, for the folks at that time, this is what was important. For, 1958, it was all about progress. W.A.C. Bennett, it was post-World War II boom. The province was taking off. W.A.C. Bennett managed to get on the front cover of Time, but it's just chocked full of old companies, all taking out large advertisements, right? And so many of these companies are now gone, but in 1958, they were still such a presence. Many companies who had started off down in San Francisco, California, and with the Fraser River Gold Rush, basically closed down in San Francisco, headed north, and set up shops here. Wells Fargo was here, the Hibbon Book and Stationery Company. Hibbon was born in South Carolina, entered the California rush, closed his bookstore in San Francisco, and came up here and set up shop in Victoria. They were the largest and the oldest book company in British Columbia for a very long time. In this same newspaper, I think this is quite something. So here they're forecasting what would life be like in 2058 on what would be the bicentennial of the creation of this place we now know as British Columbia. And look, it's very futuristic. You can almost see that this, in some ways, presages, the Space Needle in Seattle, These sorts of expositions by this point are slowly inching into the space age and wanting to convey notions of, again, progress. So it's typical from the time, really. Look, yesterday wilderness, today expansion, tomorrow challenge. But look at these population stats they have for 2058. Well, the mainland of BC, 20 million. I just got this limited edition copy of a book, which I'd always wanted. Well, look at that. The Reannexation of British Columbia to the United States, Right, Proper, and Desirable. And this was presented in 1870 by Elwood Evans, a well-known figure in Washington State, where he's making an argument why BC should be part of the United States, so they could have a continuous west coast from Washington through BC right up to Alaska, which of course they had purchased. I think part of the impetus for the reannexation of BC, this volume at that time, is of course Confederation talks with Canada were very much in the air, and so perhaps they felt this was their last opportunity to present their case to get the land back right up to 54 degrees 40 minutes, 54:40 or fight. This lockbox is fascinating and really speaks again to this north-south world of which BC was a part, you know, California, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, before the realignment that occurred with the coming of the transcontinental railways, both in the United States and in Canada. So this is a depiction really of that time period before we were reoriented into this east-west alignment. And this lockbox was owned by Dr. Arthur Goresh. Now, who is he? Well, his father was Francis Goresh, or Frank Goresh, who in 1858 moved to Victoria. He became the Wells Fargo representative here and ultimately set up his own bank. There were three main banks at this time here in Victoria and British Columbia. There was the Bank of British Columbia, the Bank of British North America, and the Goresh and Green Company Bank, a private bank. And his father, well, most unfortunately, he was escorting a huge pile of gold down to San Francisco in the year 1875, if memory serves, and went off on the ill-fated trip of the SS Pacific, the largest maritime disaster on the west coast of its day. They collided with another ship just outside the Strait of Juan de Fuca, just around Cape Flattery. And actually, there's a major expedition going on right now to recover the gold. Only one family I've read so far has attempted to make some sort of claim on the gold that that ship carried, and that's a descendant of the Goresh family, actually, which is very interesting. I hope to learn more about that. Dr. Arthur Goresh was actually born in Volcanoville, California, before the family moved up here with the Fraser Rush. Here's a gorgeous old teapot that I was fortunate to pick up in Spuzzum in the Fraser River Canyon. Oh, I don't know, decades ago now. Going back to Yale, we're going to be talking in the old historic church at the Yale site. Looking very forward to that. And then the very next day, I'll be going up to Lytton. Poor old Lytton, of course. You know, there's good news happening as they are starting to rebuild. And I would love to see my old friends up there. And apparently, the mayor, Christine O'Connor, has put out an invitation to the community to come and see Daniel Marshall at this potluck dinner. So we'll have a little sign there. You know, it's going to be very interesting because it will be held in the old parish hall. And most people don't know, but the old parish hall is right beside the Chief Spintlam Memorial, which, you know, I've been talking about for years, this stone monument to this great chief and his signal role as a peacemaker during the time of the Fraser Canyon War. So again, you know, we started to try and get this story out of the Fraser River War out to the public. So It's 17 years later since our Fraser River War Symposium in Lytton. And to go back now, and of course I've been there since to see it, the destruction was immense. You know, the whole bench land is wiped out, but for the Spintler Memorial and the Parish Hall. So I think it'll be a grand opportunity just to reflect.